Hello, my name is Arif Khan. I'm a pediatric ophthalmologist and ocular geneticist at Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And it's my pleasure to speak to you today about cornea plana as an under-recognized yet pathognomonic phenotype. I do serve as a consultant and advisor to Novartis for matters that have nothing to do with the contents of this presentation. Here's an 8-year-old girl who's referred with small eyes and high hyperopia. And from this distance, there are a few conditions that come to mind. But when we zoom in with the slit lamp and we see this small flat cornea, look how flat this cornea is with a slit beam. And also arcus lipoides, indistinct limbus, in the setting of an otherwise structurally normal eye, there's only one condition this could be, and that is recessive cornea plana. Recessive cornea plana is one of the pathognomonic phenotypes in ophthalmology. These children have small flat corneas, indistinct limbus, and arcus lipoides. Sometimes they have iris abnormalities. Often they have high hyperopia and accompanying refractive accommodative esotropia. The phenotype is not associated with axial length abnormality, and the high hyperopia that's typical is related to corneal flatness. The phenotype is specific for mutations in the gene KERA, which encodes keratocan. Keratocan is one of the small leucine-rich proteoglycans that are uniquely and highly expressed in the cornea. Keratocan is also very highly evolutionarily conserved among animals. It is important in shape and transparency of the cornea. Mutations in the gene cause the phenotype of recessive cornea plana, which also often includes corneal opacity, rarely includes corneal decompensation, and rarely includes corneal ectasia. What I really like to highlight in this presentation is that even though cornea plana is one of the few pathognomonic phenotypes in ophthalmology, it is under-recognized. When seen from a distance, these children have small appearing eyes and esotropia, typically. And when we give them their usual hyperopic correction, the eyes straighten because they have refractive accommodative esotropia. When we zoom in with the slit beam, we see pathognomonic features, small flat cornea, indistinct limbus, arcus lipoides. Horizontal ovalization of the cornea is another typical finding we see in these children, as you can see in the image to the left. In the image to the left, you can also see how flat that cornea is on the slit beam, and you can see the arcus lipoides and indistinct limbus. On the image to the right, again, arcus lipoides, indistinct limbus in an affected teenage girl. The corneal opacity in recessive cornea plana is very interesting. Sometimes it's apparent at all times. Sometimes it's apparent only in broad beam illumination, and it can look very prominent and visually significant, when in fact it's not. It's very unusual for the corneal opacity in recessive cornea plana to need any kind of intervention. And other times you can only appreciate it with a slit beam. Here's another child with cornea plana and that central corneal opacity that's apparent on broad beam illumination. It looks visually significant. In fact, it's not. And in fact, you don't even see it if you're not using broad beam illumination. But that's not why I'm showing you this case. I'm showing this case because of the other eye. Sometimes in cornea plana, we see frank iris abnormalities, extensive anterior synechia. Sometimes there's correctopia. Sometimes the pupil is really small related to iris abnormality. A rare but clearly recurrent feature of recessive cornea plana is progressive ectasia and astigmatism. Again, this is uncommon. You won't see this in most patients with cornea plana, but it does happen rarely. Sometimes these patients can even develop eye drops from the progressive ectasia. Similarly, another rare feature of the cornea plana phenotype is Corneal decompensation. Some of these patients seem to have a problem with their endothelial cells that leads to corneal decompensation, especially in the older patients. What I really want to highlight is that cornea plana is under-recognized. Sometimes it gets lumped as microphthalmia, sometimes it gets lumped as Peters anomaly if there are iris abnormalities. We as ophthalmologists should be aware of this phenotype because if we don't diagnose this condition, no one will. Here's a boy who was diagnosed as anterior segment dysgenesis and referred for evaluation. In fact, careful examination reveals the pathognomonic phenotype of recessive cornea plana and confirmed by genetic testing. He doesn't have high hyperopia, he's actually almost plano, but this is because he has long axial lengths. Sometimes these patients with cornea plana have long axial lengths for other reasons, not related to the gene mutation. Here's a boy diagnosed as Peters variant with microphthalmia. Examine him more closely, pathognomonic for cornea plana, positive for biallelic Kera mutations. Here's another boy diagnosed as Peters variant with microphthalmia, but when we examine him carefully and do genetic testing, he has recessive cornea plana. This brings me to the end of the presentation. I've gone through the pathognomonic phenotype of recessive cornea plana and its specificness for mutations in the gene Kera. It's important for us to make the proper diagnosis, not only for diagnosis' sake itself, but also so the family can be informed about the genetic implications of the diagnosis. Thank you.